Okay, episode 5. Today's guest is a guy I crossed paths with about 4 years ago at my teacher's house. His name is David Buckland. And what was the other name you go by, David?
Video.
Davidja.
Pen name.
Your pen name. Okay. Okay. Well, as usual, I don't like to do bios. I like to just let the guest talk about who they are, where they're from, what they do. So please feel free.
Okay. I'm from Vancouver in Canada's west coast. On Canada's west coast, I'm now living on Vancouver Island, which is an island off the coast of Canada, or on the coast of Canada, I guess you could say. So I live in the Pacific Northwest, as it's more broadly called in North America. Um, I'm retired now. I had a career in IT for a while, designed software for the construction industry primarily. And now I basically do research and writing a lot on spiritual topics. It's been there in the background, but it came more to the front as the awakening unfolded.
Okay. Okay. And how did the spiritual journey begin for you? I believe, if I remember correctly, way back in the 70s, Maharishi.
Yeah. In my late teens, I was reading about the newer research on brain physiology and stuff, and that led into topics of consciousness and meditation. And so I was kind of looking into it a little bit. Transcendental Meditation was really big in those days. I saw a poster and went to see an introductory lecture and was intrigued. They had a bunch of scientific research that had already been done at the time, and really enjoyed the practice. Had my first clear samadhi, or transcending, kind of dropping into silence, and became quite fascinated by the understanding behind it. And so I started studying, taking some of the classes and evening lectures and things like that they had. And then when I went on to their teacher training, or to learn to teach meditation, which is led by Maharishi. At the time, it was mostly recordings. They had course leaders who played recordings of prior teacher trainings, because at that point the organization had gotten large enough that Maharishi wasn't as available, and then he came right at the end to make us teachers. And for me, it was a major transition point. I did a lot of purification during it was a 6-month long retreat, basically. I did a lot of purification during the first 3 months, and I started having sporadic what's called witnessing. Witnessing is when you shift from experiencing yourself as a person, you kind of experience yourself as being here, experiencing through the senses, to being this observer, it's kind of up above and behind a little bit, watching the mind work, the emotions happen, the body acting, and so on like that. And you kind of have this detached observer mode. And that happened for me briefly, like for an hour or two here and there. And then in the second 3 months, there were several shifts. I had this, what I much later learned was what's called makara. This is when the kundalini comes to a point just above the third eye and becomes stable. Prior to that, it tends to go up and down. I wasn't particularly conscious of that process. It wasn't important in my practice. But it was I was basically we did this on the course. We did these what was called rounding. We would do some yoga asana, pranayama, and meditation in rounds or cycles. And in this particular cycle, I was on the floor face down doing some yoga when it had this brilliant white flash that kind of absorbed all perception. And then as it faded, I could see through the floor and the wall of the room below me out onto the grounds. And that was kind of like, well, that's a strange experience. But it passed really quickly, and it's like, well, some bit of flash, and and I sat to meditate, went on with my day. But I realized that night that the witnessing switched on and never stopped after that. And so basically thereafter there was a sense of observing witness detached from activity. And I think it was about 10 days later on the course, I had my first what's known as a cognition. It's kind of a immediate download. You just get a whole bunch of information all at once, and then you kind of have to go, the mind has to kind of process it all so you can sort of understand what it is you just experienced. But it's kind of like everything all at once. And there were some other experiences like that. And then near the end of the course, Maharishi came and made us teachers, and I had the opportunity to speak to him. And he verified my experiences and said there would be much more, pretty straightforward. And so there was kind of...
Well, real quickly, this is, it usually takes about 30, 40 minutes to get into something like this. You went right into it. Could you, I've been around it enough. I've been around Michael enough. I've read your books enough. Could you just real quickly, for the people kind of listening in, explain witness consciousness just a little bit more, just so they can kind of understand what you're talking about?
Okay. Sure. There is what's known as the self or Atman or pure consciousness, where when we're in meditation, we have that experience of just being aware without an object of awareness. We're just aware. And essentially, that can wake up so that there's kind of this quality of being the observer. Now, consciousness itself on a global level, like we have a kind of personal consciousness that's coming out here through our body mind, through our senses. But on a universal level, cosmic or universal level, consciousness has three aspects. So there's essentially what happens is it begins to flow within itself, it curves back on itself, and it becomes self-aware. So you have the observer observing itself, and then there's a process of experience between them. So there's the observer, the observed, and the process of experience. And that first shift is when the observer wakes up. It's kind of been there all along, but it's been caught in the ego, in the I sense. And so we think of ourselves in an I, and we experience ourselves as the person that's having these experiences. But when we shift to the witness, we're the consciousness that's observing the ego, doing its thing. Now, it's important to clarify that where it's a kind of an awakening, it's not the awakening. It's not self-realization, or what's also called cosmic consciousness. That shift is when the self recognizes itself through this body-mind. And that's the true awakening. But in this case, and so the witness comes with that shift for a lot of people. But sometimes the witness can come early. There's kind of a very small distance between makra above the third eye chakra and the crown chakra, and where awakening happens. But sometimes it pauses there to let the physiology catch up, and so that it can fully support a shift, and more purification and so on like that. So there can be a pause in there. So it's kind of like a quality of a full awakening, but it's like the self is awake, but it's not awake to itself yet. So you're kind of in this detached observer mode, and you see your ego machinations going on, but the ego is still identified. The ego is still caught up in there, and you see the senses happening and the actions happening and that. And before that, you kind of had this idea: I am David, and this is my body mind, and I am making these choices, and I am doing these things. But when the witness wakes up, you're the observer of that. So you're no longer experiencing yourself as doing that. You experience yourself as just watching it. And one of the key things about the witness is because it's that universal consciousness value, it's 24/7. So you're observing yourself in the waking state, but then you observe yourself falling asleep, and you watch the body sleep, and then you watch the dreams come up and fade, and then you back into deep sleep, and then waking in the morning and all that kind of stuff, and it's just kind of there all the time. Now, there's a lot of variation on how clear that is. Like if you've got a lot of fatigue, because when you're in deep sleep, the mind and senses are asleep as well, essentially. And so there's nothing to experience. There's no content. It's like being in a deep meditation. And so that requires a fair bit of clarity to recognize. So for a lot of people, they have some fatigue, from just life and staying up a little too late watching Netflix or whatever, and so that isn't as clear, but there is a continuity. And it's not something we really recognized before that, but with it, we recognize that we never come and go. We're just that sense of observing witness, that sense of inner consciousness is just there all the time. And even if it's clearer or less clear or more clear, it's still there. Whereas the ego goes to sleep with the mind. And so it kind of comes and goes. It doesn't like us to recognize that because it could lose control then, But that's what happens. And so we didn't really recognize there was a lack of continuity until there is a continuity with the witness. And like I say, sometimes this happens after people wake up, and sometimes it happens a little ahead of time. For most people, it's more later, but there are occasionally people like myself and several others I know that went through this with the awakening process.
And I've heard Christina Donnell, I've heard a couple other people talk about this where, and again, just for the listeners, some will understand, some will not. You don't, your body sleeps, but
yes.
You are aware 24 hours a day, correct? You are aware that you're sleeping.
Yeah. That's once in a while it can happen for people that they become aware while they're sleeping, and the body is asleep, so it can't move, and they're kind of like, well, what the heck's going on here? Because they can't move their body, but if there's that's going on, then the mind is awake. So it's not really deep sleep, but the body can still be asleep when the mind's awake, and there's kind of like a half sleep thing that can happen, and people can get a little bit freaked about that if they don't know what it is. But it actually happens to people here and there. It's a natural kind of thing. The most common place where people recognize this is right when they're waking up in the morning. There can be a moment once in a while where you wake up before the ego kicks in, and you're kind of waking up and you're just observing, and there's just this neutral kind of observing going on, and then the ego kind of like it wakes up and is like, oh, and jumps in there and grabs control again.
Yeah, I've experienced that. There'd be times of eyes closed, and I knew in a sense that I was aware, but I had a sense, a state of peace. And then as soon as the body, mind, and the ego would kick back in, that anxiety, that fear, that normal worry would all of a sudden just come rushing in. And I always thought it was just me not wanting to open my eyes, because it'd be an extended amount of time. It'd be an hour, it'd be 2 hours, or however long I felt it was. And I thought I was just kind of becoming aware, and I was like, oh, I don't want to open my eyes. But then I realized that most times I woke up, my eyes would automatically pop open. And then I read your book, and I read a couple other people's book, and realized that's what was happening. Now I'm not 24 hours a day like you, but it made sense to me why that was happening, and it was no longer a fear.
Well, the key is that sense of continuity. Like for me, at first it was really high contrast. Like I was aware during dreams, and so I started manipulating them, because it's like, oh, I don't like this, let's dream, And then I kind of realized, no, that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. And then I just relaxed into it, and then it just became normal. It wasn't, and that's what can happen with a lot of spiritual experiences. We can have it can be high contrast at first, and then as the body adjusts, and sometimes that just takes a few hours to become the new normal. And then when it's normal, people think, oh, it's gone away, it's over or whatever. But I mean, some of the flashy stuff can go away, but and actually what's happening is you've adapted, and it's now the new normal. And so it's not actually gone. It's just become normal. Yeah, and so for me, it was really high contrast at first, and I was like, looking at everything, what's going on now, and I can't move my body, and all that, and then it just, but I'm thinking about not being able to move the body, then the mind's not really asleep, and it can be kind of disruptive to your sleep if you're too. So I just kind of relaxed into it after a few days, and then it just became the new normal. And then I completed the training and came back into the world. But it was one of those timing things. There'd been a big boom of teaching. Maharishi had been on the Merv Griffin show a couple of times and created a lot of interest. And that there was a New York Times best-selling book on TM and all that. And that had faded by the time I got back. And so there was all these teachers that had become active with the boom. And then we were coming back as new teachers post-boom. And so there wasn't a lot of teaching going on. And there was a lot of competition for the teaching opportunities available. And so it pretty quickly became apparent I wasn't going to be able to support myself that way. I had these ideals, but and then life happened. I got married and started a family and all this stuff, and the focus shifted more to the mundane for a while. I continued to meditate and all that, and there was a continual unfolding of different types of experiences over time, but the spirituality wasn't in the forefront for a while. I was just thinking there for a moment. Like one of the things that happened, I was at a career change transition point, and I became confused because I was having these experiences. There didn't seem to be a practical value to them, like how I use them in the world, and I wasn't supported in doing any kind of sort of spiritual work that I could think of, and I actually ended up working for the police for a while. That's a whole other story. That turned out to be past life karma, but there was this really strong inquiring going on. It's like, so why this? Why is this unfolding for me? And eventually I started to have these memories that would come up that felt sort of familiar, but not really. It didn't seem to be me, but it felt familiar, and just little glimpses and stuff. And then they gradually kind of opened up, and I filled out, and I realized I was remembering past lives. And then I started to make sense of my life, why this stuff was playing out, like why the police work, for example, and why the circumstances, and it turned out this whole thing of that period of time in my life was all about my last lifetime, and the stuff I left unresolved at the end of it played out in this life. And what was fascinating to me to realize too was that it was self-induced. My own lack of resolution, or my own doubts about decisions I'd made, played out as basically experiencing the other decision that I didn't make in that life, I ended up making in this life. And so that played out, and then I gradually moved into doing IT work. And that's a whole other story, and then at a certain point, I realized it was time to leave the company I'd co-founded, this IT we were one of the .com boom companies. We launched then. And my doing that ended my marriage. Turned out to be a hot button for her. And then, and so selling the house, and so this big transition in my life, but it basically set the stage for waking up. I didn't know this at the time, but the life, this very involved, it was a IT job, so I was working a lot of hours and that kind of thing. So the whole thing falls away, and then I went through this kind of process of trying to figure out what to do instead, and kind of going in circles a little bit. And in the process, I started reconnecting with old friends from spiritual communities I was in earlier on, and I was surprised to find out that a few of them had woken up. And so, I got it. Started following a teacher that same kind of background, who had a facility for helping people shift, and indeed woke up during one of the conference calls of his, and it's because he has this kind of ability to catalyze when people are ripe, and it's kind of the so that awake self within recognize itself finally. Essentially, it got loud enough to overshadow the ego and see itself. And it only just takes a fraction of a second. It just has to see itself, and then that shift can happen. And I suspect because of the fact I've been at that point had been witnessing for about 30 years, the progress came pretty quickly after that. So I had the next stage 2 months later, which is broadly called refined cosmic consciousness or God consciousness. And essentially, to explain this, there's these kind of two parallel processes in the awakening process. There's the process of consciousness waking up to itself, first as the observer, then as the observed in the world, and then as the process of experience, and all coming together into wholeness. And then there's this other sort of more feminine process of refinement and the awakening heart. So again, coming back to the Kundalini process, the Kundalini comes up to the crown. It's like Shakti, Kundalini Shakti rises up to the crown and awakening, and Shakti joins Shiva, the masculine, and then they descend together. The observer is also referred to as Shiva. And so when they get to the heart, if it's ready, the heart this higher octave version of the heart can open, where the heart chakra is called Anahata, the higher octave is called Hridaya, and it's kind of like a more universal heart. Love for all, compassion, those kind of qualities become possible. And that refinement allows, because the consciousness, we're waking up to the deepest levels of being. And then we got our surface level of the physical experience, but there's all those levels in between. And so what the refinement of perception does is it wakes up those layers, and then that may start happening just through meditation practice, because you're dropping into consciousness and back out again. And as clarity grows in those layers, as we purify and release stress and clear trauma and all that stuff, then we get greater and greater clarity, and so then we start to become aware of those more subtle levels. And part of that process, and there's another part of it too, because there's kind of like what I call the personal and the impersonal. The impersonal is the usual, using the intellect to see the world through the intellect, like the scientist. We see principles, we see laws of nature, that kind of thing. But if we drop down to the heart, we see the same things personified. So we see the doers of nature. In awakening, we've shifted from being the doer to, experiencing ourselves as doer, to realizing that we're actually the observer, and that the doing is just happening. So how is it happening? And that's when we start to go into the what are known as the devas. The different cultures have different terminology for this stuff, but basically the beings that are the creators and the maintainers and destroyers of the world experience. And there's layers of different types of beings, and all that the layers between the surface and the bottom all have different forms of life on them, and all that stuff we can get to know. But the key part of God consciousness and why it's called God consciousness is we become aware of the hand of the divine, we could say. The creation can shift from being experienced. There's yet another layer here. Something that Sage Shankara talked about. There's an idea in the Vedic canon from India of the gunas, or they're essentially essential qualities that everything is made up of. And there's three: tamas, rajas, and sattva. Which are tamas is basically inertia, what gives things its weight and resistance to change, solidity, apparent solidity. Rajas is transformation and action, fire, transformation. And then sattva is purity or clarity. And so in the spiritual practice, we're dipping in and becoming aware of our more essential nature, but we're also doing the purification, like I mentioned. And that purification process is a shift from having tamas dominant. And when tamas is dominant in our physiology, we experience the world as solid and real, the world around us. Our perception, we can, this is the real thing, And when rajas becomes dominant, then the world takes on a quality of being illusory. You often hear people talking about Maya as illusion, and the world's an illusion. That's actually an indication of dominant rajas going on. And it's a transformation. So it shouldn't be seen as truth so much as a symptom of transformation taking place. And then the other side of that is when sattva becomes dominant. And then the world is seen as lila, the divine play. It's the play of divine, those beings, the hand of divine, all that kind of stuff. And then eventually we transcend the gunas altogether. But that's a whole other thing. And then about 2 months after and actually for me, the heart opened, and it was kind of like it needed a vehicle to flow to. Now, for some people, devotion to God comes naturally. For others, devotion to the teacher, the guru, is the natural form. But for me, that form is what's known as the upaguru, or essentially one's mate or partner. But at the time I was single, and so a good friend of mine became my vehicle for expressing love. So I kind of basically poured a lot of love on her, and went as I went through that phase. And then a couple of months after that was unfolding, then what's called unity began. And unity is where the self has woken up to itself as the observer, then it wakes up to itself as the observed. And essentially what happens is we recognize that behind the world appearance, the world of everything we're experiencing, is a kind of a screen. And that screen is consciousness that the world is playing out on. And that consciousness is then recognized to be the same self. The self in here and the self out here are one and the same. And the subject and object collapse together into one wholeness. Unity, though, is a progressive stage, because there's a single recognition that makes the initial shift, but there's a whole series of recognitions after that, because there's all the layers of experience. There's the first level of experience, and there's the second level of experience, and there's our memories, and there's There's one of the Vedas described as even the far reaches of the universe beyond perception, and all gradually is added into the whole. The Brahma Sutra talks about this. One of the old texts, they refer to it as the aggregate. We build this aggregate through this progressive recognition. That is the self, and that is the self. And so it's kind of this ever-evolving stage, but it's all about oneness. Now, and it isn't oneness on the level of a concept, but it's like right on the level of ourself, on who we are, that we experience ourselves as one with everything. And then that gradually moves out into everything we see. And it deepens too. So there was a phase in there, for example, where if I put my attention on a tree, I would become it in consciousness. Mm-hmm. So I could experience what it was to be a tree as consciousness, not as the tree itself. Like I wasn't identified with the tree or with a cat or a bug or whatever. And so it's kind of this whole diversification happens. There's a lot of different layers to it. And how that unfolds for different people varies a lot. Because what happens sometimes is people will go from that initial awakening into unity, and they won't really have a refined perception thing until later. It takes a little longer before they have the clarity. Like one of the things to keep in, it's useful to understand here, is there's those two processes I mentioned before about consciousness and refinement, development of sattva. Those are both cumulative from prior lifetimes. So when we come into this life, we start where we left off, basically. And so if we've done a lot of, if we spend a bunch of time living in a cave, we may have developed consciousness in a prior life and have that kick in fairly readily. But whether or not we've done the refinement part, that's another thing. Or inversely, we may have done a lot of refinement, but not so much on the consciousness side. Like you see these people with really fancy refined perception, but not much grounding, because they haven't developed the consciousness side. You get the sort of the extreme styles. Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of very deep questions and some superficial, but that one specifically.
Okay.
What you just said, tell me again what you just said 2 seconds ago. They have a very fancy.
Well, it depends on our balance of development. So when we come into this lifetime, now most of us have a bunch of karma to work through before this flowers. So it's not like some people kind of start having profound spiritual experiences when they're 4 and 5 and stuff. Mm-hmm. But for most people, it sort of kicks in more, late teens or sometime in our 20s or something like that. There's some initial karma that's worked through, then the spiritual stuff kind of kicks in, and we start becoming seekers and so on like that. But there's essentially those two sides where there's the development of consciousness and the development of sattva, and some people have different mixes. So some people have development in consciousness, but it's quite dry. They'll talk more in terms of emptiness and no self, because there's not, and sometimes they use that terminology because it's the terminology of their tradition. Mm-hmm. Shanti would be an example. Whereas, but it's like a drier. Their spiritual unfolding is a little drier, and then there's people who have not so much grounding in consciousness, but have more refinement of perception, and so they have a lot of, they experience angels and energy and all this kind of stuff. But if there isn't so much of that consciousness, they tend to be less grounded and a little more flighty, because there's an expanded perception without roots. And so the ideal, of course, is a balance to have both of them.
So I'm well aware of both sides. There's as you know, with the shift on this planet, there's a lot of people experiencing a lot of stuff right now, a lot of angels, a lot of that flashy shit that my teacher, you speak about, Maharishi speaks about, that is just coming and going, and it's not really part of enlightenment. It's just another experience. And then Adi Shanti is by far one of my favorite teachers. You consider, and I would agree, it's a dry awakening, right? He doesn't see a lot, but he's very, very Zen-like, very empty, very very incredible in his description
He actually
of.
sees more than he talks about, but
Okay,
he emphasizes the consciousness side more,
okay, so
because of,
he does see that stuff because he's combined the
yeah.
two, but he understands it's not important, so he doesn't talk about it.
Yeah,
Okay,
and it confuses people. Like Maharishi stopped talking about Kundalini fairly early on, because people got, caught up in the nonsense around it. Um,
chasing it, yeah, okay.
yeah, exactly. Because people, there's sort of this whole thing that's really common these days with people chasing experiences, thinking
Hmm.
that will get them to enlightenment, but it just experience just come and go. That's not what creates enlightenment, or what creates the
That's
breadth
what
of
my
enlightenment.
my teacher continuously told me, and he knew very early on that if I had flashy experiences, I'd be screwed. So he made sure everything was dry, and he always continuously told me, "Don't chase, don't chase," because I would meditate I'd transcend for 3 4 hours, and I'd come back and I'd say, "I'm not seeing anything. I'm not seeing anything flashy." He kept me away from psychedelics, and he's like, "Good. That's exactly what we want. We do not want you to chase."
That's funny. Yeah, because I had some of the flashy stuff. I
Okay.
had I had actually had a lot of it, but I did have there was a couple of experiences early on. Like I started to become aware of the beings in the immediate environment around me, and what I didn't understand at the time was that they like the attention. So they'll do whatever. Some of them don't like your attention, and they
Okay.
kind of, because of humans, or to their perception, these clumsy oafs that make a mess of things, like when nature spirits and stuff. Um, they're not so interested in your attention, but some of the beings, more around, people spaces, and they're happy to have your attention. You can ask them questions, and they'll happily give you answers, but they don't actually know anything. They'll just give you answers because they. And I caught myself starting to, like, oh, what color shirt should I wear today? And that's kind of like being stupid, and essentially giving my autonomy away, um,
Hmm.
giving my power away. I realized I was doing that, and then I just stopped. And they're kind of like, you can kind of tune them in and out. There's kind of a choice. And at a certain point, I just stopped paying much
Paying
attention to
attention.
that stuff,
Yeah.
because it was just too much information all the time.
Hmm.
Walking down the street, and there's all this stuff in the trees and the flat plants and the grass, and then there's the stuff on the roadway, and there's all kinds of stuff. And so I can tune into them now, and if there's some value there, like I go to visit, a friend of mine bought a property, and going to look at the property, and I can tune into the nature, the energy of nature around there, and the beings that are there, and if there's harmony with them.
Hmm.
One of my friends a little while back bought this property, and the David there had real attitude. They'd been the area had been wilderness for a long time, and they cleared it, and the it's quite interesting too, because property is an abstract thing. It's a concept. We put
Hmm.
lines on the ground, but they
Hmm.
don't actually exist in reality. I mean, sometimes there's natural boundaries, like a river or something,
Sure.
but mostly property lines are an abstraction. They don't actually exist. But when we create a property, when we define a property, it gets a deva. There's a law of nature that supports that. And so, like in Vastu, they have from the Vedas, that they have this process for making harmony with the local laws of nature. But of course, most of us do very little of that kind of thing. and uh,
Hmm.
so sometimes, and these guys, I don't know what happened with the development. I haven't been back to the site since, but it's one I referring to. But I could just see there was gonna be some trouble with the site, because they had real attitude. And
What again for the the listener that is in elementary or junior high listening to you talk about PhD level type of awakenings and the ability to see in consciousness. Um, when you say you can tune in and see things, is it as simple as me seeing you on this screen, or is
Yeah,
it an energy? Or okay,
yeah, and it's like shifting. It's like shifting focus. There's shifting because there's a shift to more refined perception, and then there's a shift to the heart
okay,
from the intellect to the heart. I'm intellect oriented, so that comes naturally to me. But and I'm analytical, so why it's probably obvious that I go into all these little details and explanations as I'm going along here. I love that stuff.
mm-hmm,
Um, but shifting to the heart and the more refined perception, um, it's like a different thing. And there's sometimes it's useful. Like a friend of mine, he gives the example of one time this large flock of robins moved into his backyard and they're crapping on everything. And so he tuned into the deva of the robins and then into the supervisor of the deva of the robins and requested that they move. And you be kind of respectful and this kind of thing. And they did. They all moved off into the forest nearby. An example I sometimes use, I remember on a plane flight and it got really rough. And so I tuned into the wind devas that were there. And they just basically said, well, we're just doing our job. So I tuned into their supervisors and respectfully asked if they could move off. And they agreed. And then the plane settled down. So it has there's points like that where it can be useful, but
mm-hmm.
in day-to-day life, I know a few people who work with this stuff all the time, but for me, most of the time, I don't pay any attention to it. It's just I'm a human in a human body and having a human life, and so that's where I put my attention.
Yeah, and that seems to be the thing it always comes back to, kind of like Ram Dass and his stories when he starts talking to people and the entities he would talk to or the channels he would talk to, and they'd always come back and say, "Well, why don't you just take the curriculum? What do you mean? Why don't you just be human? Because that's what you came here to do."
Yeah,
There's I Michael always taught me, and you talked about it, and I remember Mayor Baba talking about if I have to show someone my powers to prove something, that's not someone I want. That's not a student I want to talk to. It's not someone I want to teach. So there's a lot of people chasing a lot of experiences and powers and the ability. Like I'm sure people are listening to you right now. You're talking about it as nonchalantly as you and I saying I just got on Zoom call and I'm looking at David, and that's how calm it is to you because that's become the new norm. But I'm sure there's a lot of people listening in saying, how do I talk to this guy and how the hell do I figure out this perception?
yeah. But I know people though that are way more advanced than I do. Than I am. You know, they can look at someone's energy physiology. They can see the energy. They can see the astrological
Hmm.
chart. They can see their DNA, and so they're all overlaid and interrelated. Just amazing skills some people have.
Yes, it is. Real quickly, on a very superficial level, it was about 20 minutes ago when you were talking about looking, you were on the ground doing yoga, looking downward, and you had a bright flash of
So
light, and you could
yeah,
and you could see through the floor, down through the building, and outside. What is that? What? And I know it's human, and I know there's a veil, and it makes it so if we're continuously seeing that, it would be hell on earth. We wouldn't be able to function as a human. We wouldn't be able to put a spoon in our mouth. But what is that when that happens?
okay. Well, in that case, it was what was called makra. The being able to see through the wall, and that was just kind of that's never happened since. Um,
Okay.
it was just kind of a fluky side effect of the having the perception blown out and then coming back, and because like I mentioned before about the gunas, when tamas is dominant, the world seems solid and real. We perceive it that way. But as perception refines, we start to see that the objects around us are they still have the same color and that, but they're kind of semi-transparent and they're basically vibrating and they're being constantly recreated in every moment.
So
That
that
can be
that that is being seen by you right now.
I can see it that way if I want to. Yeah, it's kind of like shifting focus. Again,
Okay,
more and more of the time, I just tune into the fact that it's a physical world, so I can do normal functions.
so you
But
can live as a human. Okay.
yeah, and so you can just see the world as just like that. And then even deeper, I know people who talked about where the world almost becomes transparent. And I think that's some of what happened there momentarily when I could see through the wall. That was just a kind of a side effect. The important thing there was, and this was much, much later, a friend of mine had a book on from another tradition on the Kundalini process, and in there they talked about it. And there was a couple of things in there that I'd never seen explained before. And I don't, for me, with my meditation practice, Kundalini was not really part of the process. It just happened in the background. I'm pretty sure I had a Kundalini awakening in a prior lifetime, so it didn't need to happen again in this lifetime. It just kind of picks up where you left off again. Um, but but I didn't know why the white flash and that kind of stuff. And it's kind of later on I kind of understood it was like a drop of the divine, just this little drop of the divine, and it just blam,
Okay.
blasted.
Would
Uh, but the key part, what understanding was that the Kundalini became stable. It didn't go up and down anymore, and so the witness became stable.
okay.
And and also understanding that it paused there to prepare the vessel more before awakening. In several people I know's case as well. And so that when I did finally wake up much later, that the process went fairly quickly for a while. It kind of caught up to itself, and it started to slow down further along. Um, but um,
So for a lot of new people coming onto this path, and you see that there's considerable millions, tens of millions of people are now jumping over the fence in a sense to learn meditation, to do all this new age shit. And they hear the phrase, it's all an illusion.
it,
With your clarity and how you explain things so well, could you describe the duality? Because a lot of people who say it's all an illusion, excuse my French, don't have a fucking clue what they're talking about. Because like you said, you knocked on the desk and it's hard. So when they say the world is an illusion, could you explain the duality of that?
yeah, that's okay. There are a couple of things behind that. The word Maya is where this is coming from, and it actually means to build. It comes from the root to build. It basically refers to creation. It doesn't mean illusion in and of itself. But like I mentioned before with the gunas, there's that world as solid, world as illusion, world as divine play, based on our dominant guna. So it can be a very valid experience that the world is experienced as an illusion. However, it's transformational. It's a transitory um,
Transitory.
stage. It should not be seen as the reality. And the other part of it is their consciousness moves in rising and falling cycles, kind of like seasons. Uh, the Greeks called it the ages. In the Vedas, they call it the yugas. And essentially, there's times in history where consciousness is quite high for everybody, and many people experience themselves as if they're awake, even when they're not, just because the collective consciousness is so powerful and uplifted. And then it goes into a downward cycle, progressively and through the ages into a dark age, which is quite a bit shorter, and then comes out of the dark age and back up again. And we're in the rising age right now. We're in the second age, what's known as Dwapara, or the energy age. You discover electricity, energy healing, all this kind of thing. People tend to move to larger cities, which is what's been going on. And so we're in a rising age, but there's some residuals of the dark age still in some of the teaching. And so during the dark age, the world became very thick mud kind of thing. And so in order to make any real spiritual progress during the darkest part of the age, you needed to withdraw from the world to become a monk for a period of time. And so even in those days, kings would go off and be a hermit for a while, and to make some spiritual progress. And part of the teaching of for monks is to see the world as an illusion, and your ego is a your personality, that stuff, you want to cast that away and just live with the transcendent, with pure being, however you want to phrase that, pure consciousness. However, most of us are householders. We're here in the world. We're here to have relationships and families and friends and all, and work in a job, and we have our dharma and stuff like that. And as the saying goes, if you try to adopt the dharma of another, you'll fail at both. And so it's important to take a householder's approach if you're a householder. Now, that doesn't mean you don't go on retreats sometimes. It can be very valuable to go on a retreat, but you do it as a retreat, and then you come back into the world and you act in the world. Adopting a concept that the world is an illusion and has no value really misses the point. You wouldn't be here in the world living your life if there was no point to it. And so it kind of depends on how deeply you bought into the narrative. But people do get kind of caught up in ideas like that they should skew the world. I fairly regularly meet people who are trying to figure out how to abandon their life and move into an ashram somewhere so they can make spiritual progress. But in actual fact, they'll probably get worse because they're not living.
Stunt their growth.
Yeah, they're avoiding their life. I mean, because it can seem very attractive if your life isn't kind of going the way you planned, and you don't really like what's happening. It can be very easy to reject it and leave it behind. But that actually isn't helpful. I made this mistake myself. I attempted to go off on a monk's program at one point when I was younger to deepen my experience and all that, but I got no support for it, and finally kind of clued in that that wasn't my dharma.
You should be doing.
Yeah, there's a thing in the back of one of Maharishi's books where he talked about the different paths to God, and there's the path of karma and the path of the intellect and the path of the heart. And on the path of the intellect, he said that you have to become a monk because you need to withdraw from the world so you're not distracted and you can analyze very closely. But what he didn't say, and I think should have been said, is that none of us are on a pure. We're not just this. It's like I have that intellectual tendency, but I also have a devotional part, and my dominant dharma is probably a karma yogi, because it's been very much about the doing and being in the world is my actual thing. And so and it's also that the karma yogi is also the path of perception, and that's been quite dominant in my spiritual process. So it's when I act in that way, I don't always have the experience that I want to have, but I make more spiritual progress that way. I can remember I mentioned before I was going through this process, and I ended up deciding to leave the company, and my marriage came apart and all this stuff all at once. What I realized then was that whole period was really grounding for me. I gone off into the transcendent and had all these beautiful experiences, and then getting out there in the world was really grounding, and it brought it down and integrated it. And so I had prepared without even realizing I was doing it, I was preparing the ground to wake up. I was continuing to meditate, but the rest of my life was completely devoted to being in the world. And that was what I needed, and that was what I needed to do. There's an old saying from India, they call it dyeing the cloth. If you, in the old-fashioned way, when you want to color a cloth, you would dip it in the dye, soak it in the dye, and then you would hang it up in the sun to bleach. and then you put it back in the dye,
Mm-hmm.
and then hang it up and keep doing that until the color is fast. The color stays in the cloth. And that's the meditation practice, dipping in the cloth and then bleaching it in the sign of activity. And you do that, and then it becomes solid. But if you don't do that, you kind of like, oh, I don't really want to do that kind of work, and I'll just live in my parents' basement, and and not engage in activity. Then that dye doesn't become fast, and so all your it's not that your practice is lost exactly, but you don't make the same kind of progress. And a lot of progress happens on subtle levels out of our awareness. And so in a lot of ways, we just need to be regular with our practice and lead as best a life as we can. And don't try to fight and resist things, just with where life is taking us. And we get the best results. That's what I found.
Beautiful. Yeah, and the explanation of the illusion is talking about it being transitory is kind of like the growing number of people who have great experiences with psychedelics, but they continue on taking them time and time again. That is just another experience. It's transitory. Then they have to come back to being human. They have to come back to being reality. It is an experience, but they should never take that as reality.
Yeah. Psychedelics are a little problematic. They become a little more popular again recently. They, as you say, they have a distorted perception. It tends to be about chasing experiences, rather than going for what's actually going to get you awake. But also it tends to be, particularly some of the plant medicine kinds of approaches, tends to be quite traumatic on the energy physiology. So you're actually traumatizing your energy body and creating junk that you have to clear in order to be able to make spiritual progress.
Okay. All right. There's a great pivot right there. So there are a lot of my guys that I play soccer with, a lot of neighbors, a lot of friends. They have a lot of trauma. They want to heal. They want to clear things out. And it's always ayahuasca. It's always a medicine journey. It's always mushrooms with the soccer mom down the street. And they always, 99% of the time, they come out of it feeling as if they expanded their consciousness. They feel like a weight has been lifted. You are saying that that may be the case, but on a more subtle, deeper level, it's actually causing damage that they have to work on. So it's kind of like it keeps.
What they're using, like some of the stuff is quite a bit stronger. Like people that routinely throw up, and that kind of stuff, in taking it. That's clearly creating trauma. I know a couple of people who had a bad LSD trip and they never recovered. Yeah, I can understand where that might be used in carefully controlled environments for treating people with major psychological issues, something like that. Yeah. I know people who view it as a practice. I've not seen that. The people I know that have had time with psychedelics have tended to have more to clear on their path later. Now, sometimes it's gotten them on the path, like Rick Archer talks about that. They did some drugs and stuff early on, and then he realized that it wasn't a long-term solution, and that's when he took up meditation. And that kind of thing happens where I can see it as a discovery process. And sometimes people have experiences that are really mind-opening and helpful for their process. It's kind of like playing with fire is kind of the way I see it. I mean, there's that potential, but there's also the potential for a traumatic experience that gets in the way of your process. So it's not a healthy path to my mind.
Well,
And that stuff was used traditionally. It was used in very specific circumstances
Mm-hmm.
and very controlled circumstances as well. Um, and and that was what was available to them. Yeah, it's tricky territory. I mean, you can't say universally that this bad, this perfect. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it depends on the person, and that's one of the reasons why there's all these different flavors of teachers and processes out there. I mentioned earlier about path of the intellect, path of action, path of devotion and stuff. There are people that are do better with this or that. I'm currently studying trauma therapy, and it was not something I ever expected to do, but I kind of got pushed by nature, so to speak. They give me really strong signals to take this direction. Anyways, and and in there it's really quite interesting because the school has basically studied a bunch of different uh, approaches and stuff and taken the best and refined it down. But there's this whole process where you work with the client to figure out what would work for them. One of the big ones is you start off by finding resource, which is essentially a sense of inner calm or safety, depending on how you relate to those words and so on, and how that is for somebody. Like, can they find that in their body? And is it going to be in their foot or in their heart, or where are they comfortable that way? Or can they find it in their imagination? An imagined scene that they remember, or a memory from the past. Um, and then using techniques to anchor that so that you can come back to that if, when you step into your trauma, it becomes a little too much. Then you can fall back into your point of safety and so on. Those kind of processes are much more effective, but they're not quick. Depending on the nature of your trauma. Like if you have trauma from a car accident, um, it can be acute, but it's a single incident that can be, it's pretty straightforward to clear. But if you grew up in a household with a drunk, abusive father, um, then you're going to have this sustained trauma that has become entangled with the identity. And so that's going to be, it's usually quite thoroughly suppressed. So a lot of people aren't even aware of this stuff. And so it's going to be more involved to unravel the entanglements and then to release the trauma. But it's powerful stuff. It can be very effective.
It seems,
And it's
it
interesting,
seems, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
it's quite interesting too, because for me, I got pushed into this, and I think a big part of that is because I've not been as in the body as I thought I was, with all this transcendence, and so that presence has not, like, it's a lot of I've done some energy healing work and that kind of thing, and a lot of the charge is gone, so there isn't sort of the reactivity and stuff like that there once was, but some of the latent impressions, in the Vedas they call them the vasanas, or the reactivity, the reactive points, and the samskaras, the impressions, the habit patterns, the way we tend to respond to certain circumstances. Those are much more somatic, much more bodily, and require a little different approach to get at. And that's what I've been studying. And I think that's part of, I was pushed in this direction to help embody more, because part of the waking up is just the first step, and then you're basically bringing that forward and then embodying it, and right in, through those layers between the bottom and the top that I talked about earlier, but all the way up right into the surface, the bodily experience. And then you're basically like a lighthouse in the world because you're radiating that presence all the time around you, and you're
Seems,
enlivening. You're just, your activity and your thinking and feeling and all that stuff is enlivening that.
it seems that, I mean, you, Maharishi, my teacher, Ramananda Sagadatta, Adyashanti, Yogananda, all these great teachers, the topic of psychedelics are never at the forefront of anything they talk about or
No,
teach. If
no,
anything,
Maharishi
it's
spoke
something
against.
they push against. They say no.
Yeah, yeah. Maharishi also talked about taking care with Kundalini techniques. Because sometimes what people get the idea that, because I mentioned about the Kundalini at different points and so on, but some people get the idea then that Kundalini is causal, that Kundalini creates an awakening, and that so if you can push your Kundalini and get it going, then you'll get better results. But in actual fact, Kundalini takes care of itself. You do the spiritual practices, Kundalini will rise all by itself. It'll do its own thing. You don't have to worry about it. And it's just, it's useful to understand that energetic process is taking place to help you support and embody the awakening. But it can make your process much rougher if you push it energetically, because then you're basically forcing this powerful energy up into places that aren't ready for it yet. And then it just kind of creates a jarring effect and potentially energetic trauma again.
Well, I mean, if you go on YouTube nowadays, every other video is someone trying to teach people how to awaken their Kundalini through a meditation. And to your point of other techniques taking longer than others, it seems like psychedelics have become very popular because it's a immediate reaction
Yeah,
without really understanding the long-term effects of
yeah.
what
But
they're
again,
doing.
it's like the experiences.
Hmm.
Like the ego is in there trying to control the process and make something happen. When awakening has nothing to do with the ego. Awakening is like one of the key things that I remember realizing is that I had this goal for years of becoming enlightened. And I realized at a certain point that it's not David that gets enlightened.
No.
We transcend David. It's consciousness itself that wakes up to itself and then wakes up to itself more deeply and further and so on. It's consciousness that's waking up. It's not David. I'm waking up from David. I mean, David's still there but our orientation towards David is different. But we don't stop being human. We don't lose our abilities. I mean, there can be some things that fall away that weren't, part of the Dharma, or we were kind of being that way because that's the way we were raised, or what society expected, or something. And some things can fall away. But in general, we broadly speaking, we still have the same life, but now we experience it from a different place. And there can be a realignment, so we're more in our Dharma, and Dharma kind of means purpose, or why we're here, so to speak. And there can be a realignment with that, but yeah, enlightenment isn't an escape, and it's not really a goal either, because
No.
it's not like once we're enlightened, then everything's done.
Mhm.
No, instead, it's like enlightenment gives us a platform for living a better quality of life. So it's not the goal in itself. It's what supports having a nicer quality of life. So you're not caught up in your stress and your karma and all that, and your ego trying to control everything. Instead, you let all that stuff go, and then you experience yourself as a cosmic being, enjoying this life that you've been given, and the gifts that you've been given, and and stepping into the flow of life that is intended for you, or whatever. And so things, when you act with life, life acts with you and supports you. So things happen much more smoothly. It's always a flag for me now if things don't go smoothly. Then I stop and say, okay, am I going in the wrong direction here, or is it the wrong time? Because I'm used to things going smoothly now. I certainly wasn't when I was younger. and that allows us, we learn to trust life better as well.
This was quite a while ago, but I'm sure a lot of people would love to hear your explanation of this. Um, when we are fully waking up, we understand that, past witnessing, past all of that, we understand we are not the doers. We understand that it's just being done. If that's the case, then why? Why are we even having this conversation? Why are we in this physical body if we're not the doers, if everything's just unfolding as it is?
One of the things I do is I frame the process in terms of normal human development, the understandings we have from biology and psychology about how we grow. I mean, we come out of the womb in this really kind of amorphous, energetic state of like little balls of love, basically, and but very dependent. And then there's a process of we're basically experiencing ourselves as one with the mother. So there's this process of separating from the mother to become our own self, and then recognizing ourselves as distinct from the people around us and stuff, our father, our siblings, whatever else, and becoming our own entity. And there's this shift of development. Like first, the focus of development is on the body, and then around age 2-ish, you get the terrible twos when they shift to the emotional body, and they shift into this emotional dominance, and suddenly their emotions get really loud. I want, no, all that stuff. And then there's a progressive deepening until we get into the mental body around school age. Kids get ready, then they can start learning about ideas and stuff more, and learning to write, and they have the ability on that level to start to do more sophisticated things with their bodies, and so on. There's this progressive deepening. And in a natural evolution, in a higher age, we would continue evolving into enlightenment. The self would be kind of there in the background, and then as we mature physically and can support that process, then the awakening can take place, and then we live our adulthood awake. And so what's happening now is we're moving back towards that. It's certainly not the norm, but it wasn't very long ago that awakening was rare. I mean, I talked through the unity stage. There's further stages after that, and some of those stages I hadn't even heard of until 10 years ago. And then people started living them. And it's this remarkable unfolding that's taking place that these things that Maharishi talked about back in the day that, I started to be a little dubious about, but, now I'm seeing it happening. And when you get all these people awake in the world, it's collective consciousness that they're awaking. It's not their personal consciousness that's awake, it's collective that's awake. And so it lifts all boats, basically. And so everybody is lifted. But for people who don't have a spiritual practice or a way of processing their stress and so on, it gets more in their face. Because what was unconscious before is becoming more conscious. And so it starts to cause people to have to purify who are not on a path. And oftentimes those people don't understand what's going on. And so what you see happening is a lot of fear. People falling into fear narratives about how the world's falling apart, and there's a lot of craziness. People are far more reactive. But what's actually taking place is a collective purification going on. And if you know what that's about and how to process this stuff, like studying a bit of energy healing or energy work, whatever, some of these other kinds of techniques, then you learn how to work with it and can process it, and then you experience rapid growth and evolution. And but if you're not, if you're fighting it and saying, "Oh, I want it how it used to be," and all that, then you just experience a lot of struggles and difficulty. But we're in a major collective transformation, and it's not obvious to a lot of people yet. It'll become so in time, but and so what you see is a lot of and I've been surprised by who people that have got caught up in that they're just falling into fear narratives and conspiracies and this kind of thing when they're well educated and spiritually evolved people. But unless you recognize this dynamic, it's easy to get caught into it, just like we got caught up in the ego's narratives before.
Yeah, that's a big thing that I've always been curious about and talked about is you can have a 160 IQ, but you can have no clarity and you are an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
It's the
you have people who are quite awake and have some amazing gifts, and yet have childhood trauma that plays out, or they experience power for the first time and behave inappropriately with students. They don't understand power dynamics of teacher-student relationship. So you get all these sort of messes out there in spiritual communities with teachers behaving inappropriately and stuff.
Yeah, that seems to be common.
Yeah, I mean, there's now, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there's now the Association for Spiritual Integrity was created because some of that was managed by traditions.
Mm-hmm.
The teacher would tell the student when they were ready to become a teacher, and so they would usually let them mature into their, Ken Wilber talks about wake up, grow up, and clean up. I think it is. There's not just one. If you can wake up and still be kind of messed up in certain ways, and so it's like the whole thing is needed. I wrote an article recently about responsibility because one of the things that happens when we make spiritual progress is our attention and intention becomes more powerful. So it becomes more important where we're putting our attention, and so there's the responsibility increases, and the consequences increase too if we mess up. So a spiritual teacher messing up like that can create difficult karma for themselves.
Well, every time I'm listening, there are about a half a dozen more questions I'd like to ask, just to allow people to better understand what you're explaining. But it is Friday afternoon, so and I don't want to keep you too much longer. Hopefully, we can just do a second one and we can dive deeper into this, because truly, every time you're talking, I'm texting myself new questions. But there are two main questions that I know a lot of people would like to know, especially from you. You've been talking about it for the last hour and 20 minutes, but very simply put, because Donald Hoffman and more people are talking about the subject of consciousness, there are still a considerable amount of people that think that consciousness is created by the brain. Could you explain consciousness to the viewers, what it is?
As I mentioned near the beginning there, I became quite interested in brain research early on, and I've studied it here and there later too. And I understand where that comes from. When you're in that tamasic mode, the world is solid and real, and so the idea that consciousness is some amorphous, subtle thing, seems ridiculous. Like that's their experience. But when you have a few clear experiences with a decent effortless meditation, then your opinions will start to change,
Mm-hmm.
because then you realize, and especially after something like a witnessing shift where you experience consciousness as being there all the time, and when I'm sleeping, when I'm so here the mind is asleep, and yet here I'm still conscious,
Mm-hmm.
and or I mentioned about past lives, or a more direct one would be uh, well, there's beings that operate on other levels,
Mm-hmm.
and none of this makes any sense unless consciousness is the container of all of it. And then deeper on, you actually experience it that way as well. You experience that universal consciousness. And one of the things in a post-unity stage, one of the things you can become aware of is where consciousness comes from. And essentially, there's these what I refer to as divine qualities, uh, and one of them is alertness, which is kind of like the Shiva value. The is not conscious; it's just alert. And then there's this quality of liveliness, and then there's this quality of intelligence in there. And what happens is the liveliness stirs the alertness, and the alertness becomes aware. And then, as I described earlier on, it begins to flow within itself, and then it curves back on itself and it sees itself. And then you get what amounts to globally aware consciousness. And then you can experience, potentially, different people are kind of oriented around different uh, different styles. I find it really interesting to compare notes with people who experience deeply, uh, because they come to it from a different perspective, and their emphasis is a little different, and so they'll explore certain things from a different angle, and they'll have insights and so on like that I find interesting. It's sort of like, I came at the statue from this side, but they came at the statue from the other side, and so they can see different things that I didn't see, and they can point it out, and so I can get insights from that. And now I've lost where I was trying to go with that. Oh yes, so that you can recognize consciousness as aware of itself globally, and then at the next stage of it is it becomes aware of at every point within itself, and then some of those points express forward as people that are become experiencers, uh, what people would call the jiva or the soul, uh, and all that stuff can be directly experienced. So then it becomes obvious that consciousness isn't created by the brain. Now, the brain and mind and consciousness do influence each other. Like with the body changes state, like one of the reasons they argue that is the body changes states. We go from waking into sleeping, and our consciousness changes quite a bit until we're witnessing, right? So before witnessing, we're awake and then we're asleep. Consciousness seem to go away. So of course it's the body that's created by the brain and the mind. But then we start witnessing and see that consciousness is there right through the whole thing, all the changes. And then we realize too, there's kind of like a neutral gear. As we're going along in waking state, and we go to shift into sleep, we drop into this neutral gear for a moment, just for a fraction of a second, and then we're in sleep. And then we kind of get deeper and deeper, and then we shift into dream state. But each time we drop into kind of a neutral gear, and that neutral gear is just consciousness itself. And they've done this research on transcending samadhi, and in meditation, and when people are experiencing just being conscious without any content, and there's that sense of continuity can be experienced in there briefly, universality, it feels eternal and infinite. And I mean, there's a number of ways we might come to this, but it's really common that we eventually recognize through if we practice some of this stuff, we can come to recognize that indeed consciousness is affected by our conscious awareness is affected by the state of our nervous system, but consciousness itself is deeper than that, and it has a deeper origin. And there are people like Bernardo Kastrup and that are bringing a science approach to this question and demonstrating other types of experiences that show that consciousness is universal.
Yeah, that's. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, but it's an experiential thing. If you just go with your own personal experience, then it's very easy to make that kind of choice. And you can certainly point to like states of physiology and so on as affecting consciousness. But when you look at the broader human experience through the ages, then you can see there are styles of experience that are not explained. They even call it the hard problem of consciousness because so they say it's created by the brain, but how is it created by the brain?
Mm-hmm.
There's no explanation because it's not, basically.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's in many ways the brain is like a radio receiver.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's processing the information coming through it. It doesn't originate anywhere. Just like the radio station is not inside your radio. It's all around you.
Yeah, I've one of the guys I play soccer with is a neurologist, and we've had this discussion a few times, and I love listening to his explanation. It's
quite the brain physiology is quite fascinating.
Yeah.
We spent when I was in grad school, we spent a while going into this stuff, and it's just amazing. We had a whole section just on the difference between male and female physiologies and the differences in the brain and capacities and abilities and so on like that. And on that measurement, in general, women are about 30% superior to men.
I think most people know that by now.
We might not be as large or as strong, but there are, in terms of abilities, other abilities, they're ahead of us.
Yeah, he's got some unique explanations as to why he thinks the brain creates consciousness, but that was perfect. Well, that will help a lot of people because not only do you give a description very intellectually, but you always give great examples to simplify it for people who don't understand the intellect part of it. So thank you.
Yeah. I do have a tendency to go abstract. I appreciate that too. So to try to explain.
We'll wrap.
I was going to say, when I first started blogging, I called my blog In Too Deep.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let me ask one last question because we're an hour and a half in here.
Right.
And I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about this because you basically explained it for the last hour and a half. What is truth to you?
That's an interesting question. I've kind of concluded that truth is relative. It's relative to your stage of development, essentially. Because the truth in one stage is different from the truth in another stage. When you're in a identified ego and Thomas dominant, you experience the world as solid and real, you experience yourself as an individual, and there are certain truths that we determine about the physical world, but the physical is dominant. When you're in unity consciousness, by contrast, several stages away from that, we experience the world as in ourselves. It's like, before you experience yourself walking down the street, then it becomes like the world is coming to you and you're moving through yourself. And you experience, whatever you put your attention on, you have the potential of becoming and experiencing as. And so essentially you are whatever your attention is on. And so everything is included in you. And that kind of grows and fills out over time. And there are various, depending on if there's been a God consciousness phase or not, there's various layers of reality that are unfolding. So, there's not just that surface experience and the transcendent, there's all the stuff in between becomes conscious. So you're aware of the stuff going on on the different levels at different times too. So it's not just a world and a person, it's all this other thing. And so the truth is very different then. To me, reality is, which truth comes from reality. So when you're talking about truth, it's important to recognize where you're speaking from or to. Like sometimes when you're listening to a spiritual teacher, he seems to be contradicting another spiritual teacher, or even that he's contradicting himself. But in actual fact, what he's doing, he's talking to a different stage.
Mm-hmm.
So the teacher who's talking to the person with the ego is not going to say the same thing as the teacher who's talking to the person who's in advanced unity somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Because the truth for them is different. What they need to do and what their reality is different. Now, reality as itself is, well, Buckminster Fuller referred to humans as special case. We experience one thing at a time, sequentially. It can be a really big thing, but it's one at a time. We're not really built to experience everything everywhere all at once, to reference the movie title. That's not how the human physiology is built. We can get a sense of it, but to really get truth in an absolute kind of way, we'd have to have the ability to experience that. Now, what becomes clear through the process is that we're in this together, and each of us has our role to experience, to bring out the details of some aspect of the whole. And so each of us has our role in the whole to have the experiences and bring out the details of that part of creation or the universe, however you want to frame this. And so reality becomes known through all of us together, and not through an individual nervous system, but through the whole. And so one of the things we're moving towards as a collective is all these different parts waking up to their essential nature and experiencing their part of the whole and bringing that into the collective. And so it's kind of like the Brahma Sutras I mentioned early on, where there's all these pieces that are brought together into the one aggregate. It's that taking place, but on a collective level. So there's a collective, a collective totality that's being built, and we can talk about big visions of that, but we're still just getting a glimpse of the larger reality of what is. And I think that glimpse will get bigger and bigger. But there's a model in the Vedas called the Kala model. Kala means time, but in this case it's a reference to an evolutionary stage. And there's 16 stages in this model, and I'm trying to remember them. Like the first stage is basically rocks, and then it's plants, and then waterborne animals. I don't remember exactly. Egg-borne animals, and then womb-borne mammals, basically, and then something like that. And then there's kind of humans, which are kind of in this range from about 6 to 9. But essentially the most enlightened human is a 9 on a scale of 16. And then you get avatars and stuff like that. Now, some humans call themselves avatars, but that's a whole other topic. And then you can experience yourself as one with an avatar, but if you have a human physiology, you don't have an avatar's physiology. It's a different thing. yeah, so there's this potential past being a human, um, but that's not why we're here. we're here as humans.
Well,
So yeah, so to me, truth is relative to the stage of development, and reality is a we're getting we have our piece of it that we're here to unfold, and and to and by doing that we share it with others. There's kind of a process I mentioned about a cognition, kind of these that you get where you get a big download of all at once. There's kind of three levels of that. There's kind of a basic cognition where, like the example I gave, where I experience things that other people have experienced already. It's like it's lively in consciousness, and so different people can have that same experience. And then the next stage is when someone comes along who is there to re-enliven it in the collective consciousness, where that particular perspective or perception of reality has gone dormant in the collective, like in a dropping cycle in consciousness. And now a rising cycle, there's people that can come along and revive experiences that have been lost in time, bring back aspects of reality that have been forgotten, and laws of nature, abilities to do certain things, all kinds of stuff. And then there's this what I describe as a Vedic cognition. It is the key people in history who are born to wake it up in the first place. And they're basically people who are evolving creation. They're designed to wake up new principles or laws of nature in nature by experiencing them. And then they wake up and begin, they integrate with other laws of nature and begin doing stuff, evolving things. What's his name? Rupert Sheldrake.
oh, Sheldon.
Sheldrake. He's done some interesting research on how laws of nature get established in consciousness, like when they discover a new element. At first, its melting temperature varies, and then it kind of settles in and becomes stable, and then it's always the same. As it kind of becomes, it's like it's become woken up in the collective.
Mm-hmm.
That's from a scientific perspective versus a cognition, but yeah. Anyway, so there's kind of that where those when we experience our part of the whole, that can evolve the whole collective.
every every time you talk, there's like a dozen more questions, like because you start going into a scientific explanation. There's a lot of people here that are not going to understand the Vedic type of teachings you're talking about and the words you use. So as soon as you go science, I want to go into a science angle because there's a lot of people who would understand that better. I hear you talk about the most enlightened human on the planet being 9 out of 16, and that leads me to other beings, other entities, other planets. I remember Michael told me that Maharishi, someone asked about aliens, and he said, oh, they're the truck drivers of the universe. So he just nonchalantly just pushed it away. Then you go back to what you see when you tune into other entities, other beings, whatever you want. There's just so many
Oh, there's
things that
layers.
I know. Oh my God, man.
And even just something simple like archangels, like a kind of angel supervisors, we might call them, like the senior ones. There's all these different systems that have counted them, and they're all different
Mm-hmm.
because different people experience different ones,
Mm-hmm.
and so they're a different number counted, and different lists have different ones in them or different names. One of the things you see in Buddhism is the Buddha cast away all the paraphernalia and stuff, all the systems and stuff, and then gradually over time people experience that stuff and they added it back in again. but with different names. And so you got these Vedic gods that are now in the Buddhist pantheon with different names, but you can kind of see their qualities are similar. And some of them are in the Greek, and some of them are in other kind of Western kinds of models too. But they're kind
which
of seen differently. And
that type of information, that type of explanation simplifies and answers a billion questions for so many people who have different religions, different constructs, different beliefs, different ideas, and saying, well, my God's this and this God's this, and why does my God do this? And well, there's a different name over here, but this one says it does the same thing as this one and this. And then that's what I love about speaking with someone like you, because you just
yeah,
cut through thousands of years of wars and conflict and division and people wondering what the fuck's going on. And then you just say, well, this is why. And then everyone's like,
yeah. There's a
oh, okay.
key detail there. It's worth mentioning, and that's what I call personalization. And that's kind of back to the intellect versus heart modes of experiencing. When you're in the heart personalizes things, and so um, there's this dynamic that takes place when you're experiencing, say an archangel as an example, where when we experience them, um, they'll appear to us, uh, like they'll adapt their presentation. Like they don't need a form, but they'll present a form to us so we can relate to them.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
that will come through our filters, or like cultural
Through our
expectation.
conditioning. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So, for example, when people experience angels from the West, or light beings, maybe a broader term for that, they'll have the tendency to see them with wings and flowing robes.
Mm-hmm.
But there's absolutely no need of wings when they're not physical. They just move by the tension.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the way we relate to them, and the way artists kind of embellish their experiences, because they kind of have this quality of being a cloud of energy. And
Yep.
so so the flowy energy stuff they depict as robes and wings and stuff. And so a lot of people have that kind of expectation, or this, that Jesus looked a certain way because a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of guys in the Middle Ages painted them with a beard and uh, and so on. Um, and so there are these cultural influences, and that's what's called personalization. But it's really interesting dynamic because it's right there in the relationship. And so what we're expecting to see, but also there from their side. Like the first time I experienced one uh, form of God, uh, they gave me a Persian name, and it's an ancient Persian name, and it was basically to bypass my conceptions of who I was experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
So they gave me this name. I didn't have any, didn't know, and so I had no preconceptions about who they were. And only
Yep.
later did I realize who they actually were. What actually were is the wrong way to put it, but who they were historically. Um, uh, when I kind of put two and two together. And it took me a little time to figure out what the name even was, because it was ancient Persian, and it's like ended up chatting with this guy about it who was Persian, and he calls his dad in Iran to look it up in this ancient book of ancient words or something like this to find it, and that's how I found out it was Persian. Uh, but I had a sense of it because there was that sort of sense of that part of the world, but so it came up in conversation, and yeah, it's funny stuff.
Okay. Okay.
So it's
So,
useful. It's not about the form that you're experiencing, and there
right.
are entities who can appear like they're great light beings and look all fancy when they're not. They're just presenting as being fancy. They have the control over their appearance, and
Yeah.
so yeah, you can't. What you have to do is pay attention to your heart. How do they feel? That tells you what they're about. If
Well,
if
that
appearances are deceiving.
very simply put into mainstream for people is kind of like the movie Contact when Jodie Foster sees her dad. And he just says that we come back in this form so you guys can understand and feel comfortable with us. So, and we started this question at a minute 25. It's now 145. So really quickly, I will wrap this up because I have a friend by the name of Ryan, and he warned me. And when I first met him, do you want the short version or the long version? And I say 99% of the time, I'll ask him a question and I'll say, oh, give me the short version. And it'll be very quick. I'll have to remember that next time we talk. I'll say, hey, David, short version, buddy, short version. But I will. I'll wrap this up. I'll get it on YouTube in a couple weeks, and I'll put your book and your website on it and everything else. And it's Friday afternoon. I just sent you an email today. I really appreciate you jumping on so quickly. I'd love to do another one because there's details that I think we go into science and that I think a lot of people will enjoy because they're going to see this and they're going to have a million questions. So I'll have them watch this and I'll find out what their questions are, and maybe we can come back to a second session with the viewers' questions.
Yeah, if you could send me the link too. I usually put those on my
Yes.
website too.
Oh, absolutely. I will. I will.
Yeah.
David, thank you so much for the time. An hour and 45 minutes. I think that's perfect. I'm gonna go grab some dinner. I assume you'll do the same. And as soon as this goes live, I'll shoot you an email.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. See you, man.